Hello and welcome to Central Coast Newspaper's Video News. My name's Jackie Pearson. I'm joined today by Mr. Alan Hayes, OAM, from the Australian Coal Alliance. Welcome, Alan.
Thank you, Jackie. Pleasure.
I first came across Alan in around about 1987 through his syndicated newspaper column called It's So Natural. I was back working for my local newspaper, putting it on the page. And then, all these years later, I realised that the Alan Hayes campaigning against longwall mining in the Jirralong and Jarramalong valleys was the same Alan Hayes. So you're not a typical anti-coal campaigner. I'm wondering if we can start our conversation by talking about why you have spent the past 20 years campaigning against this mine.
Well, the reason why I've given so much of my life to doing this is because I believe it is the right thing to do, because I believe that longwall coal mining beneath the major water catchment supply for the entire Central Coast region is inappropriate. There are too many ifs, too many buts, and the mining company has never been able to establish that they will protect the water catchment. It is impossible, because wherever you find a longwall coal mine above or in close proximity to a riverine system, the water disappears.
Now, you gave me, about 3 years ago, an excellent description of how the Central Coast water catchment area actually works, and in particular the importance of groundwater and springs. Can you explain our catchment?
Well, it is very important. It's a very small catchment, and we don't have the luxury of going across the hill to another one, but it is primarily aquifer fed. 68% of the water that charges the Wyong Creek and Jillaby Creek comes from the underground aquifer. The rest comes from precipitation, and the problem is that if you have subsidence and the water goes down into the ground, you lose that recharge, but you also lose the water coming down the streams, because the creek beds can't throw up an invisible barrier and say, hey, listen, the water continues down to the pump pool to be pumped into Marty Dam. It also goes with the rest of the water, so we effectively lose our water supply.
Now, whilst our council was under administration, our freshly amalgamated Central Coast Council, the administrator, who just happened to have been appointed and reported to the Department of Minister and Cabinet, Premier and Cabinet, they made a deal with the miner called a water compensation scheme, which the Planning Advisory Commission then accepted and recommended the mine for approval. Can you talk about that water compensation scheme and why it doesn't fix the problem with loss of water from the catchment?
Well, it's flawed from the beginning, because the mining company is alleging that only 300,000 megalitres a year need to be treated by reverse osmosis, which they haven't been able to determine if they can treat it. They haven't been able to determine what they're going to do with all the saline water that's left over that would go into Wallarah Creek, which is highly toxic. The water in the mines, because I know we've had it tested through another campaign that we're running when it was coal seam gas, is high in barium and extremely high in salt, 10 times higher than what was coming out of the Powder River Basin in Wyoming, where it caused mass environmental degradation. That's where they're doing the coal seam gas mining. Now, the mining company, where the 300,000 megalitres came from, nobody can determine that. It was just a figure plucked out of the air, because when you read their own EIS, they talk about a minimum of 2.5 to 3.25 megalitres a day being lost from the catchment. So we're looking at 1,100 to 1,400 megalitres a year.
Right.
So if they can treat, and I say if, because we don't believe it can be done appropriately, it still would fall short of what's being lost from the catchment. And that doesn't take into account during times of drought like we are at the moment, where you get very little stream flow. You've still got the aquifers flowing. So any water that then goes back into the pump pool is going to be lost anyway.
So, Alan, would you advise me to allow my children to drink this treated mine water, or would you be allowing your grandchildren to drink it?
No, I wouldn't be allowing my grandchildren to drink it. My granddaughter or my daughter and a husband I would be paying if they haven't already, if they couldn't do it themselves, to put a water tank in and say, you're better off catching the water from the roof and filtering that than what you would drinking treated mine water.
Okay.
The analysis of it, which I have seen, because when we were fighting coal seam gas, a couple of characters apparently managed to obtain some of the water coming up from the coal seam and had it tested, and then the community had it tested by the New South Wales University. And it's very toxic stuff, you know, it's not very nice, and reverse osmosis is very expensive. And this is one of the reasons why we've been able to challenge this in the court, because the mining company hasn't been able to show how they're going to do all this.
Okay.
And it was put forward into the future, and the PAC let that go.
The PAC let it go. Then we've had the mine referred, or the approval of the mine referred to the Commonwealth, and I know you've met with Environment Minister Frydenberg. He sent it out to an independent scientific committee. They seem to be accepting what the PAC said. What would you say to Frydenberg now, leading up to his deadline to make a determination under the EPBC Act?
Well, if I can get a reply from Lucy Wicks's office as to sitting down and talking to me before he has to make a decision, what I would say is that the nub of the whole issue was the water trigger, and his department did not ask the IESC to deal with the water trigger. The other thing that concerns me about that is that two of the original commissioners or committee members on the IESC were replaced by two more, and there seems to be a softening of the report. Now, since Julia Gillard was in government, there's been enormous pressure by the South Korean government to have this mine approved. Now, whether this softened approach is because of that, only Frydenberg can answer that. But regardless, the bioregional report made it quite clear that there was no data available for the Jillaby Creek area, which is the most critical area of the whole issue, because that's where the mine sits above. Now, the IESC actually didn't recommend approval of the mine, nor did they recommend that it should not be approved.
They did.
They took a two-way bet, so that they covered themselves.
Okay, but you would argue that there's political pressure on Frydenberg to let it go through?
I would, and I would be very surprised if that political pressure has diminished over the years.
Okay. Now, you mentioned your Land and Environment Court action. The Australian Coal Alliance is being represented by the Office of the Environmental Defender, I believe.
That's right.
Okay. And so you're challenging the New South Wales approval?
We're challenging the New South Wales approval on 10 grounds. They're very solid grounds. And that was because the mining company failed to do certain things that were required under the Director General's requirement, and then the Planning Assessment Commission failed to take that into account. They ignored it and allowed it all to be put forward to a future date. And you can't do that. The whole idea of exploration and producing an EIS and doing the things that are required is to determine from the start whether the project's viable. And the reality of it is, if you can't do those things, there shouldn't be an approval. If you do them and you find it's going to be a catastrophe, you don't get an approval.
Right.
But the system in this state, and probably in the whole of the country, is so broken and corrupt that the mining companies have an expectation that once they pay that money to the government for an exploration licence or lease, they will get their licence. They can just cruise through, the Department of Planning take care of it, and nobody cares whether the things are actually done. And that's always been the way it has been in the past.
You mentioned federal member for Robertson, Lucy Wicks, who is in one of the most marginal seats in the country. She holds it by a margin of 1,089 votes, I believe. But this mine is going to be near Blue Haven, and it's in the seat of Dobell. Why should Lucy Wicks be concerned?
Well, the mine might be in the seat of Dobell, but the mine has an impact upon the entire Central Coast region. The water catchment valleys behind Wyong are the major water resource for the entire Central Coast region. The water is pumped from Mardy Dam to various regions down here in Gosford. What isn't pumped directly to various holding places in Gosford goes to Mardy Dam, and then it's directed from Mardy Dam down to Gosford. Only 18% of the water comes from Arimba Creek and from Mooney. The rest of it is coming from those water catchments. So to impact on that water catchment and lose it has an impact on the entire Central Coast region. It doesn't matter whether you live at Kincumber or whether you live at Charmhaven, it will impact on you. And therefore Lucy Wicks needs to be concerned. She was concerned sufficiently enough to speak to me earlier on this year and arrange an appointment with Josh Frydenberg late February. She needs to be concerned now, and I'm waiting for her to get back to me, because if she ignores the issue, I can make a promise to her that she will lose her seat, because myself and others will ensure that the people of Gosford are aware that she is not acting in their best interests.
Well, they're fighting words. You have the support of Central Coast Council. Central Coast Council don't want this mine.
Of course not, because they employ some of the best experts in the country to look at it. And they only needed to look at the deficiency in the mining company's own data, and there were too many holes, there were too many gaps that show that they couldn't protect the water. But all the experts from local government, from the ACA, all that evidence seems to have just drifted above the PAC's head, and they've relied entirely on what the mining company's water consultant did, Mackie, and he drew his data for the water studies from a gauge on Wyong Creek, which was broken, so it was historical data, and from a water gauge on Wallarah Creek, which was from the period of 1969 to 1976 when it ceased to operate. Now, under the Director General's requirements, the mining company was required to drill no less than 114 boreholes in a grid across the mine area. They did not do this. Yet when you read the IESC report, they say that if the mine was to proceed, they would need to monitor the water so that if there was going to be a problem, the mine would be closed down. And to monitor it, they say it has to be done from the boreholes that don't exist.
But the idea that you monitor as you go.
That's ridiculous.
What happened to the precautionary principle? We're talking about water.
That's right.
We're talking about a water supply for a region that is pitted to have major population growth.
That's right. Well, that is not adopting a precautionary principle, because once the mining started, the mining company's not going to stop. Now, the previous Labor government in 2011 rejected this mining company's development application because there were too many uncertainties, and that the precautionary principle must apply, and because the mine wasn't in the public interest. None of that's changed. All the mining company did was resubmit the same DA again. It's all the same data.
Alan Hayes, I could talk to you about this all day, and I know that you could talk about it all day. But I also know that the Australian Coal Alliance is still raising money to fight the mine. What if what you've said today raises concerns within the community, renewed concerns? What can the residents of the Central Coast do?
They can make a donation to the cause. They can go to chuff.org. There's a donation page there. Or they can go direct to the Australian Coal Alliance website page, which is just australiancoalalliance.com. And there's on the site, there's a page set up which gives the bank account details and information so that they can make a donation directly into our account. But all funds raised are going directly to the coalfight, and if Josh Frydenberg doesn't reject this mine, which he should, we'll also be challenging that in the federal court.
Okay, watch this space, folks, and thank you, Alan Hayes, for your contribution to the community, and thank you for joining us today.
Oh, my pleasure, Jackie.